Good afternoon, everyone. We know that people are dealing with the security system downstairs, coming in slowly. We are also streaming this event, so we figure that both actually in the room and virtually, a lot of people are about to see something very interesting. My name is Jane Harman. I'm president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I'm very excited to host our brilliant friend, Sir Julian King, for an important discussion of, quote, a state of UnPeace, love that term, the EU's response to asymmetric threats, unquote. This is something Sir Julian knows a lot about. This is something the Wilson Center cares a lot about, and this is something you need to learn about. So it's the trifecta. Here we are, and we're all going to learn things. And Sir Julian has long prepared remarks, and I said, uh-oh, that will take 3 hours. And he has summarized them, and so I'm not exactly sure which bits we get. But then what happens after that is I will ask him some questions, and you will ask him some questions, and this event will take precisely 1 hour. That's our plan. So Sir Julian was appointed the EU's first ever Commissioner for the Security Union in September 2016. Alas, he may be the last British commissioner of the EU's security union if the UK leaves, if Brexit actually happens. We were just talking about that. Please say no. Previously, he was the British ambassador to France and Ireland and a longtime diplomat in EU and UK institutions. The Security Union, which was created in response to the European migration crisis and terrorist attacks in Brussels and Paris in 2015 and 2016, focuses on 5 major priorities: international cooperation, data collection, border controls, terrorism, and cybersecurity. The last two, terrorism and cybersecurity, represent a persistent and growing challenge to the EU, and I would say, and the US, and most of the world. As advancements, I think I'll skip much of this because you're going to hear it all from him, but Europe confronts many challenges, including the fact that they don't make the technology. There are a few smaller technology firms, but most of it's made elsewhere. I think Sir Julian will talk about 5G. If he doesn't, I will talk about 5G. But Europe faces questions such as whether and how to deploy 5G networks, how to prevent terrorist attacks, how to deter state and non-state actors, and to conclude, no better person to analyze, unpack, repack this information than Sir Julian King, who will make some opening remarks now. Welcome to the Wilson Center.
Thank you very much. Thank you. How do we do this? We do it like this.
Like that.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to do 2 things, slightly quicker than I was planning to, but I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the growing and evolving set of security challenges facing both sides of the Atlantic. And then against that background, a little bit about the European Union as a security actor. Now, you kindly invited me because you saw something I said about UnPeace. And I'm going to start by talking about that. What is this state of affairs, UnPeace? It's not the name of some new snazzy UN agency. Rather, it's the state of international relations that has much in common with other words sharing the same prefix: unease, unrest, uncertainty. You could, of course, argue with some justification that the Cold War was a period of UnPeace. But the very fact that it was termed a war implies that in the minds of governments and the public at the time, they knew there was a sense of conflict. Certainly no one alive in what we used to call the West when I was growing up was in any doubt that we were slap bang in the middle of a conflict which looked alarmingly warm for something that was supposed to be cold. The difference today, I think, can be categorized in terms of 3 things: threat actors, threat vectors, and thresholds. In the past, it was easier to determine who was attacking you, how they were doing it, and when the line between peace and war was at risk of being crossed. Today, that isn't the case, or is less clearly the case. Part of that's to do with the source of the threat actors. In the old days, the USSR was clearly the bad guys. There was no question of where the threat was emanating from. Yes, there were various different theaters around the world where this conflict was playing out, sometimes kinetic, sometimes not. But it was pretty clear who your allies were, and most importantly, who the enemy was. And that's not so clear anymore, not since 9/11, although arguably some of the historical bad guys never quite shook off their typecasting. And today, of course, the threat comes from non-state as well as state actors, some with motives that are clear, some much less so. And many of today's enemies are able to exploit the increasingly connected world we live in to run global supply chains and operations, to pop up and disappear almost at will. Not for them, the huge military hardware parades of yesteryear, although, I have to say, if you're watching television, Beijing didn't do a bad job the other day. Today, there is also the ability to produce some malicious code to shut down your power grid, which is a further part of the explanation. The channels for threat, the threat vectors have evolved. In the past, we were talking in terms of troops, tanks, missiles, machine guns, with added disinformation, the occasional exploding cigar or poison-tipped umbrella. Today, the concept of total war has taken on a whole new dimension, not in terms of saturation bombing, but rather insofar that effectively nothing is off limits. Infrastructure, culture, social media, public administration, public services, information, the economy. The list, like the threat surface, is endless. The tools are equally diffuse. Everything from creating and exploiting infrastructure or economic dependencies, foreign direct investment, influencing via diasporas, weaponizing democratic systems, disinformation, promoting social unrest. The rules have been redrawn. Indeed, sometimes it seems there aren't any. And such a multiplicity of actors, channels, and tools brings us to the third key challenge, threshold. While it's always been possible to say one thing whilst doing another, something of an art form in the Soviet era, it was nevertheless pretty clear if your tanks started to rumble across the border into Afghanistan. There was not much plausible deniability about that. However, in today's world, short of deployment of conventional military means, the proliferation of channels and tools makes it possible to accomplish what traditional military objectives, for example, annexing part of a neighboring country, without necessarily or immediately triggering the threshold between peace and conflict. Often the arsenal that is being deployed is hybrid rather than conventional. That not only redefines the threat vectors, but also the threat surface. And it means that previously civilian operations, like the European Union, find themselves sometimes on the front line of risk mitigation and threat deterrence and defense. Indeed, the combination of multiple synchronized tools coupled with deliberate ambiguity about true intentions, linked to deliberate threshold manipulation, plus distraction and subversion of democratic systems, is the unprecedentedly dangerous UnPeace that we live in. And one of the key questions, it seems to me, for us on the other side of the Atlantic, given all of this, is what about Europe and the Europeans? What are they going to do about that? The obvious conclusion is that in some areas, we're going to need to be much more ready than we have been to stand on our own 2 feet. But equally, we're going, as much as ever, to need to work with our allies and like-minded partners, notably the US, to protect and promote our shared values and defend against those who are seeking to do us harm. NATO is going to remain absolutely vital, but the European Union has a role and a responsibility as a security actor. It's going to need to step up. It means that we need to manage our differences. Obviously, the transatlantic links remain deep and strong. But recently, there have been some differences that have risen close to the surface. We've long had disputes like chlorine chicken, GMOs, which reflect differences perhaps in how we approach risk, regard science, the relationship with big business. Recent US policy has added some other areas where we currently diverge, climate change, Iran. There are further rumblings on trade. I think we need all of us to be conscious of the risks and to seek to avoid being tipped off balance at a particularly dangerous period. After all, the evolving threats we face on both sides of the Atlantic, whether from terrorism, cyber, stem from hostile actors seeking to challenge our shared core values and our way of life. That's true of the Islamist extremist threat. It's true of cyber-enabled hybrid threats that we are facing, which have the aim of disrupting our economy, raising questions about our democratic processes and debate, sowing divisions within our societies. Now, against that background, the EU has, over the recent few years, sought to step up to counter these threats, to identify our vulnerabilities, and to build capabilities to resist and counter them, whether that is countering terrorism, cyber-enabled, or other hybrid threats. When it comes to terrorism, which remains a real challenge, certainly in Europe, even if Daesh have been rolled back on the ground, we've sought to close down the space in which terrorists and hostile actors seek to do us harm by denying them the means they use, whether that is access to money, firearms, explosives, the ability to travel. We've built the resilience of our borders. We have reinforced our cooperation through reinforced European agencies. We've provided funding to help our cities and local authorities better to protect our public spaces without changing their open character. We have completely reformed our arrangements for sharing law enforcement, counterterrorism information between European partners. We've worked upstream to tackle radicalization in our communities and online. Online is a real challenge. There is far too much radicalizing terrorist content still online. We propose measures obliging internet platforms to take down terrorist content within 1 hour of being notified and prevent it from being re-uploading with clear rules and safeguards. And I hope that we're going to find an agreement on this proposal very soon. It's not just jihadi extremism that we need to tackle in Europe. More and more, and in part as a reaction, we're seeing material from the extreme right, church being a sad example. When it comes to cyber, for classic cyber threats targeting systems and data, we have revised our cybersecurity strategy. We have built a new EU cybersecurity agency. We've developed a blueprint for dealing with big attacks. We're rolling out a program for setting standards to drive up cybersecurity all across the board. We've tested all of this through a series of cyber exercises with NATO. We've developed a cyber diplomacy toolbox, a set of measures to respond to malicious cyber attacks, including a sanctions regime, targeted restrictive measures to deter and respond to cyber attacks. When it comes to deterrence, we're making it harder to get away with using cyber to attack us. We've proposed to make it easier to access electronic evidence in order to hold perpetrators to account. And indeed, because this is a shared challenge, we want to work with the United States so that your legislation, the Cloud Act, can work effectively with ours. We've also turned our focus to cyber-enabled threats like disinformation, especially attempts to interfere in our democratic processes. There was a big debate in Europe, as there has been here, about this in the run-up to the recent European parliamentary elections. We took a series of countermeasures. We built a rapid alert system to spot and map coordinated disinformation campaigns. We brought together people who were responsible for cybersecurity, data protection, and running elections from across Europe to build a network of best practice. And most importantly, I think, we worked with the big internet platforms to sign them up to a code of practice on disinformation, which drove transparency on political use of the social media platforms. I think this made some difference. There was no big spectacular hack and attack during the European parliamentary elections, but those elections were far from a disinformation-free zone. There was still lots and lots of disinformation circulating, which shows that we need to do more on all of those fronts. But in particular, I think we need to continue to put pressure on the big social media platforms to promote transparency in our political debate online. We've made progress around transparency of political ads, but there's a lot more we still need to do on tackling bots and fake accounts, which are far too active, circulating disinformation, and to open up the big platforms to independent scrutiny to ensure that they're not just marking their own homework. We need to continue to make progress on a range of other hybrid threats. There are some traditional threats that have come back, I'm afraid. CBRN, chemical. We've seen chemical threats used on the streets of a small city in my own country, the United Kingdom. These are no longer abstract challenges. We know that there's a new challenge from drones. We've seen it in Iraq and Syria. We're now seeing it much closer to home. And there are some challenging new risks on the horizon. AI, for example. On all of these issues, we need to make sure that we're cooperating very closely with like-minded partners and with NATO. And the EU needs to step up and play its role in tackling the full range of new and hybrid threats. As I said, I think the EU as an institution is actually quite well placed to do this. By their nature, hybrid threats are difficult to identify and deal with. So you need to be flexible. You need a wide gamut of possible policy responses, something that the EU has. You also need a broad sense of deterrence. Again, something the EU can help with by reinforcing resilience across the board, making ourselves harder to attack, identifying and tackling vulnerabilities, building capabilities. And one of the key vulnerabilities that we need to tackle, again on both sides of the Atlantic at the moment, is the risk to our critical digital infrastructure. How do we secure what is going to be the fundamental plumbing of our interconnected lives? There's a lot of debate at the moment around 5G. We in Europe start from a slightly different position from the US on 5G. There's more of it in the ground. There's more Chinese tech in the ground in Europe than there is in the US. We have more of a distinction in Europe between trade policy and security matters than is sometimes the case in the US. But we face the same fundamental challenges. So we set out earlier this year a 3-step plan to try and address these challenges together, working as Europeans. The first was every member state, all of the 28 member states, produced a national risk assessment, their perception of the risks of 5G, to 5G. Then we are going to combine those different risk assessments together. That's in fact something we're going to do next week to publish a synoptic overview of the risks to 5G in Europe. And finally, by the end of the year, we will set out a toolbox of measures that we propose to take to manage and mitigate those risks as far as possible. But we said from the outset that it was possible at the end of this process that we would find that some of the risks were very difficult to manage and mitigate, that some products, services, or suppliers might be deemed unsafe. This is, I think, a big deal. It's a big deal here. It's a big deal for us. Even if we start from slightly different positions, I think it's really important that we find a way of managing this discussion effectively together. I've already talked for too long. You want to ask me some searching questions about all of that. I think it's really important that we recognize that the EU can and should play a role on these security issues. Not alone, working very closely with like-minded partners, like-minded organizations, notably NATO. There are undoubtedly an increasing number of obstacles on the path to ensuring the security of our citizens in the UnPeace of today. But as Woodrow Wilson himself once said, the only use of an obstacle is to be overcome. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Yes? Do all of you appreciate how good that was? Raise your hand if you did not think it was good. Okay. So Julian, let me just start with security, yours. I said sort of blithely in my remarks that you might be the first and last.
My job security?
Yes, your job security, the first and last to hold your position. I now have thought about that. I've reconsidered. It's an EU position. So Brexit, if it hopefully, even if there were a hard Brexit, would not affect your personal job security? Please say yes.
Oh, no, I go when the UK ceases to be a member state.
Okay, good. Now let's move to EU security, because we know that there have been recent parliamentary elections in the EU countries, and a lot of jobs have turned over. My dear friend Christine Lagarde has had her 400th farewell party. I attended it last night at the French embassy and has left town today. And so she will become the new head of the European Central Bank. Ursula von der Leyen, the former German defense minister, will become head of the EU, and a lot of other jobs have turned over. How does that affect the function that you have?
Yes. So there's a new commission coming in. If it happens according to schedule, that'll be the beginning of November. And that's a whole new range of people working on these issues. Mm-hmm. There will be some continuity. Some of the people who've been working on these issues under this commission will still be there. Notably, the tax lady, Margrethe Vestager, who will have a wider...
She's fearless.
Will have a wider digital role,
yeah,
which will encompass both, I think, some of these security issues, but also linked industrial policy issues. So she'll have a role. Other colleagues I've been working on some of these issues will still be there. Maria Gabrielle, who's been working on disinformation, will still have a role. But there'll be new colleagues as well.
And you, my friend?
And I am only able to be a commissioner as long as the United Kingdom is a member state of the European Union. So when that ceases to be the case, there isn't a British commissioner. But it's very important that this work goes on, and this work will go on. There will be a continuing focus, as there has been in recent years, on stepping up to try and address some of these security issues. And that's, partly because we've made some sensible proposals, but I'm not naive about this. It's really because of the threat picture.
Right.
It's because the threat picture has forced people to refocus on these issues and discover the truth that they are more secure, more effective when they work together.
Well, surely the attacks in Britain, the attacks in France, the attacks in Brussels, among other places, have focused attention, the attacks on trains, etc. So, but let's go over then, now that I'm in withdrawal, understanding that you might not be in this position for the long haul. You might be, but you might not be, because you have contributed so much here. Let's go over a few things that you said. You mentioned 5G in your conclusion. As I understand it, today, October 1, is the deadline for the EU-wide risk assessment of 5G networks. You said all the countries were contributing. Now, a huge issue in this country is around a Chinese company named Huawei, and whether any Huawei components can be in the U.S. 5G network. They already are in the 5G network,
the 3 and 4G networks,
and the 3 and 4G networks in Europe. So you very carefully said that there will be an assessment of risk, and there will also be an assessment of suppliers. Where do you think this is going?
So this is an example where of what I was just saying. Where across Europe people have understood that in order to deal with some of these new challenges, here's a very cutting edge challenge. How do you secure your critical digital infrastructure? You need to work together. These are issues that touch upon national security, core national security, but it's really quite difficult, especially if you're in Europe, to do these on your own, because what happens in your neighbors makes a difference. How you approach these issues is going to be crucially affected by a whole range of different policies that you have that you work on with your neighbours, and sometimes at a European level. So they came together and have done this work on a voluntary basis. We can't oblige them to do this, but they've come together, and every member state has done their national assessment. Next week we will produce the collective synoptic view of the risks to security of 5G in Europe. And it'll be really quite tough. It'll say that there are some really big risks that we need to manage, because the technology of 5G changes things. It will increase the overall attack surface and the number of potential entry points for anyone who's seeking to attack. It will enhance the reliance of our mobile network operators on third-party suppliers, increase the role of third-party suppliers, and it increases the role of software and services provided by third-party suppliers. So that, again, means greater exposure to vulnerabilities that may derive from the risk profile of individual suppliers. Malicious actions or security flaws, such as the presence of intentional or indeed unintentional backdoors, are going to be easier to introduce and harder to detect. And this new world of 5G will inevitably end up becoming critical infrastructure, meaning that it's not only questions of confidentiality and privacy that we need to worry about, but also integrity and availability of networks, because it's not only spying you have to think about, it's the ability of someone to reach in and turn things off, deny you the services. Against that background, you have to take some serious measures. All of that is true. That analysis is going to be shared without having to cite a particular country or a particular company. So I hope that we're going to come together in the European analysis and the US debate around the risks and what you need to do to mitigate the risks, even if sometimes the political starting point and the political debate has been differently framed.
Well, that was extremely artful, and I also think extremely cogent. I mean, in this country, I'll say it, Huawei is the bad guy, and if we just get Huawei out, everything is fine. But that's not necessarily true. There are lots of bad actors.
So that's true, but it can't. That is arguably true, but it is not the whole story. As I said at the outset, we started from a different place around this. We have Chinese tech in the ground. We have more Chinese tech in the ground than you have here in
we have some too.
You do.
Don't tell anybody, but we do.
But you've got fewer telcos who've invested big in China.
But some of them are around some of our most vulnerable sites.
So that's one factor. The other factor is that there's a different way in which the debate works around security and trade in the US and in Europe. We historically have stood for free and fair trade and open markets, and our markets stay open as long as you meet the rules. The question then is, what are the rules? We don't reach for blanket bans. So the rhetoric around these issues can be different. But the reality, when you dig into an analysis of the risks, is going to be very similar. And so I do hope that we will find, as this debate evolves, that the analysis here around the executive order and the listings and the analysis in Europe reflect the facts and the risks, and that we can come together closer than we have been perhaps earlier in the year in how we think about these issues.
Well, I surely agree with you personally, and I'm guessing that some of the Wilson geniuses sitting in the front row here would agree too. Problem is, if we, the United States, take a different course from the rest of the world on this issue, we could be isolated. And I think that would be very bad for our security, and it would be enormously bad for our economic security. And I think it would accomplish exactly the reverse of what our intention is. Do you think that's fair?
Well, I think that we need to make sure that we all work together to try and have a risk-based approach to this, and that we manage to decide what are effective measures. And those effective measures can be very tough. And as I said, once you introduce the dimension of supplier vulnerabilities, you have to ask some tough questions, not only about the technical side, but also about the non-technical legal environment in which suppliers are working. And when you start to dig into that analysis, it may lead you down, a certain road. And we may find at the end of this process that we are closer together than it appeared earlier in the year.
So turning to two other topics, and then I will call on all of you for questions. I have the speech that Sir Julian didn't read. It's longer. It's very good. What you did read, your notes were exceptionally good, and within 15 minutes, which is what we were hoping for. But you talked about three things: threat actors, threat vectors, and the threshold. I don't think you addressed the threshold as you summarized, and it's really interesting what you mean by this. So would you explain?
Well, forgive me if I hopped over that. The point about threshold, it seems to me, is that once you're in a hybrid world with lots of different things going on at the same time across different threat vectors using different means, it's just sometimes less clear not only who's attacking you, but in some situations whether you're being attacked. And therefore, you have to deal with the inherent ambiguity of that.
Right.
So it's not just complicated. It is complicated, but it's not just complicated. It is inherently ambiguous. And I think that requires a wider range of responses. And therefore, I would submit a wider range of security actors. It's where the EU, not replacing anyone, but complementing other security frameworks, can play a role. Because you have to be very flexible. You have to have lots of different ways of thinking about countering such a threat. And you have to be able to build your basic resilience. You have to make yourself a less attractive target. And those flexibility, the resilience, require a wider, broader set of policy approaches than the traditional security actors tend to work with. So this isn't about replacing NATO or anybody else in their security role. It's about complementing it with other organizations that perhaps in the past weren't thought about as security actors, but need to be thought about as security actors, need to think of themselves as security actors, and need to step up to those responsibilities. Does that make sense?
Yes, well, it does to me. I mean, I find this all extremely complex, but hence your term UnPeace. And you made a point that the Cold War was not actually a war. It was more of an UnPeace. But that leads to my final question. I, last year, debated a proposition at the Oxford Union. It was quite a fun activity, along with a team of a few others, including a student. And our proposition, I took the for side, was the war on terror has not made us safer. And I argued that, and my side won, so of course I was right. But what I argued was not that we don't live in a dangerous time, an UnPeace, but the war frame, it was not an adequate frame for what confronts us. And terror is a tactic, it's not an enemy. And rather than basically cede the turf to the other side, there is a better way to frame this without using the word war and without saying that what's coming at us is just terrorism. It is terror. I mean, there are terror tactics. But I argued that to defeat this challenge, we need a better argument. That's what we need. We don't need better bullets or better landmines or better tanks. We need a better argument. And winning the argument is very difficult. And you do address that in these remarks. But my question to you is, as we're talking about UnPeace, do you think a big part of this is reframing the problem and coming up with compelling reasons why the societies in which we live are more attractive to these people than the brainwashing that they get from wherever, they're not all Muslim, the brainwashing that they get from whatever ideology that causes them to engage in acts of terror?
So basically, yes. If people are seeking to attack our values and our society, whether that is through jihadi terrorism or indeed far-right violent extremism,
yeah, right,
or through cyber-enabled disinformation, the best way to resist that is to have a very positive affirmation of the values that we are seeking to defend. And the front line for quite a lot of this, certainly on the terrorism side, is combating radicalization. One of the things that we have to, I was talking about denying the bad actors the means that they use to attack us. One of the means that they use to attack us is manpower. They recruit people to pursue their violent agenda. And I'm afraid that is still very much a current threat in Europe. It's not so much at the moment people who traveled to Iraq or to Syria and come back, although that threat remains. The recent attacks, as you know, have been people who never left. They were radicalized in their own hometown, sometimes
That's true here
in their
too.
own homes.
Yes.
And that is about a battle for their imagination.
It's the battle of ideas.
It's a battle of ideas.
Right. All right. We have almost 20 minutes for your questions. Please identify yourself and ask a question. That would be best. One of the geniuses in the front row, Diana Negroponte, a Wilson Scholar, is recognized.
Sir Julian, thank you very much for your presentation.
Sort of.
Sir Julian, you have given us a superb analysis of the problem and the discussion on threshold. But what remains in doubt is the willingness of the EU to play a leadership role. So let us say that threshold is broken. Will Brussels wait for Washington, or will Brussels take the lead?
Yeah. I'm not sure that microphone is working, by the way.
No, I don't think it is either.
All right. But Julian's brain is working, so he will now respond.
Okay. So I'm not arguing. No part of this argument is that the EU as a security actor should replace other frameworks for cooperation. But there is a responsibility to step up and take action if it is justified. The area where this is toughest, I think, at the moment is the cyber area. If you talk about terrorism, there have been a series of measures that have been taken. There have been a series of measures taken on countering disinformation. But on cyber, there is a debate that is still underway because although we now have an agreement that the EU could play a role in responding to cyber aggression, using the things that it's got in its toolbox, particularly economic sanctions, and we have clarified, including in legislation, the things that would trigger those kind of sanctions. We haven't dealt with the question of attribution. So yes, there will be action. Yes, at this kind of threshold, the action would kick in. You would take sanctions against ... We have provided for those sanctions to be against individuals and economic entities. So you don't have to designate a whole country. But this question of when would enough people agree who was responsible for a particular piece of cyber aggression remains a challenge, and I recognize that challenge. I don't think it's unique to the EU.
I don't think so. And that is what attribution means for anyone who may not be as steeped in this.
Sorry.
All right. Question over here. The microphone is now working?
Correct.
Correct. Good. Identify yourself and ask a question.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz, and I'm wondering, you're talking about misinformation, and there are supposedly legitimate organizations that actively push misinformation. What do you do about that?
The work that we've been doing on mis and disinformation in the political space has been to reinforce resilience and awareness of this. So there's some quite long-term education work that needs to be done. There's work that needs to be done in support of diverse media. There's work to get all of the member states to take this problem seriously. Not everyone was taking it as seriously as perhaps they ought. But the key work we've done has been with the social media platforms, who are the vector for this. They are abused to spread some of this political disinformation. And with them, we are seeking to shine a light on the provenance of political information. So we're not saying that somebody, still less a private enterprise, should be making decisions about whether a piece of political content is true or false, good or bad. In a European context, we simply couldn't do that. That is the slippery slope towards censorship, and at least half of the member states lived under censorship in their recent memory. So there's no way we're going to go anywhere near that. But you can have some rules, maybe you can make them binding rules, around transparency. If it's paid for advertising, who paid for it? How visible is that? If it's sponsored content, who's behind it? If it's being circulated not by human means, but by machines, whether it's bots or fake accounts, you can make that apparent. And you can open up the social media platforms to external scrutiny so that we can study examples of mis and disinformation that have happened in the past and learn from those how better to map, follow, and counter that kind of activity. So that's the stuff we've been doing.
But would you not ask them to take down content, for example, about an active shooter or an incitement to violence or pornography?
There's a range of online harms that come from different sorts of abuse of our online social media platforms. There is stuff that is illegal, child sexual exploitation content. We, in Europe, have now got a definition of terrorist content in law, so terrorist content is illegal. If it's illegal, we say that you can police it. We would say that that is not cutting across any First Amendment considerations or free speech, because it is illegal and you are policing it. And there we have got some rules for identifying content and asking people to take it down. Then you have a range of stuff in the middle, which is more disputed, which is sometimes called hate speech. And there, some countries in Europe have got laws which identify certain sorts of hate speech, and they've made it illegal in their law, and therefore you can act against it. But actually, that reflects different countries' histories and traditions and cultures. There isn't a shared view across Europe of what would count as illegal hate speech at the moment. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have political activities and information, where I think it's personally, I would fear to tread on making judgments on individual pieces of content, but you can insist on greater transparency. So you need different reactions to the different types of harm, if that makes sense.
Seems very complicated to me, but in the back, the woman with the ponytail, right there.
Thank you so much. Marian Back from Inside Cybersecurity. You've talked a lot about the importance of working together and ultimately, optimistically finding a solution to our common threats. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the differences in regulatory approaches between the EU and the US, especially since the private sector is responsible for about 85 to 90% of our critical infrastructure. So, in terms of having basic resilience and making yourself more attractive or less attractive a target, especially, when is it appropriate to tell private sector entities, you have to do certain things,
Yep.
Cyber hygiene things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there is the stuff you need to do to make yourself more secure against classical cyber interference, hacks and attacks, which is to do with securing, first of all, securing your infrastructure, and then making it run effectively so that it is resistant to interference. And on that, I think you can exaggerate the difference between how it's done in Europe and how it's done in the US. In fact, we have rules in Europe that are largely derived from the rules and good practice that's been set up here in the States. We copied the system that you have, NIST, I think it is, for the specialists, of requiring private sector actors to have plans for dealing with how to secure their infrastructure and how to respond if there are attacks. We've copied those essentially in Europe and set up a system with rules and regulations and some legislation that reflects that. When it comes to content, the stuff we've just been talking about, so this isn't an attack on your infrastructure, it's using the infrastructure, in effect the social media platforms, to pump out harmful material. There, I think there are some differences between how the response here in the US is working and how we're proposing to respond in Europe. And that basically comes down to, I don't think it's a private sector, public authorities thing. I think it's First Amendment. The system here has been more resistant so far than we have been in Europe to thinking that there are certain things that you might want to police online. We're readier to identify certain sorts of content online as illegal, and therefore you can police them and you can require them to be removed.
What percent of your, I don't know how to ask this, the questioner did. She said that 85%, I think that's right, of the internet is in our private sector. What percent in your?
At least more. I mean, you're talking about critical infrastructure, yeah. So large parts. I mean, in some sectors, it's way above 85% of the critical infrastructure is in
I
private
think she's
sector
going
hands.
to clarify this for us in.
Yeah, I think
5
it's worth
seconds.
noting it's not 85% of the internet, but 85% of critical infrastructure, so including
Okay,
electric
85%
utilities,
of critical infrastructures in our private sector.
communications networks included, but
Okay.
the wider world, water
it.
systems.
And you think, is that true worldwide?
I don't know about
I
worldwide
wouldn't
because
say
there are
in
different
China.
there are different
I wouldn't
ownership
say.
models. Yeah,
Just saying.
But
Okay.
in Europe and the US, a huge percentage of the critical infrastructure that we're talking about is private sector. And therefore, you have to get the model of cooperation between the public authorities and the private sector right. What I was saying is that in the US and in Europe, for critical infrastructure, there are rules. For harmful content, there's a difference of approach.
Well, just an interesting little factoid. In this country, everyone is worried about election security, as we all should be. Well, maybe not everyone, but most people are worried about election security. Our Homeland Security Department has declared voting machines and other election devices to be critical infrastructure. Problem, our Constitution says that states shall regulate the time and manner of elections, not the federal government. So this has been a tussle. It's now, there's been major signs of cooperation among the 50 states and the federal government, but it didn't start that way. And that's because of the way our government's organized. So,
Well, if it
are
makes you
there
feel any
issues
better.
like that in Europe too?
Yeah, if it makes you feel any better, it's even worse in Europe.
Oh, it's
so,
Fine.
so
It's worse.
the European parliamentary elections, which I mentioned that took place earlier this year, were conducted across 28 countries. Running elections is a national responsibility, so that's 28 times the rules. And in many of those countries, that national responsibility is devolved to regions or local administration. So that's 28 times X, where X is quite a large number. And that is the complexity that we've had to grapple with on our side of the pond. You can set guidelines. You can bring people together to exchange best practice. You can introduce maybe even some rules around the need to defend that critical infrastructure against basic cyber interference. But you still have the problem, at least in Europe, we've had the problem of politically motivated disinformation, the information space being used to try and affect the integrity of the democratic debate and the democratic processes.
As we have. Reminds me of one other thing. Even in the case of cyber or drones or all the new forms of threats, artificial intelligence, these are security threats. And NATO is, so far as I know, was designed to be an international security organization, which includes the United States. It also includes Britain, regardless of Brexit. What's the line between, or is there a line between what the EU should be doing about all this and what NATO should be doing?
Well, as I hope I was clear in saying, this isn't about one organization replacing another. Mm-hmm. It is about working together effectively, each using the networks, the tools, the traditions that they have at their disposal. So I'm very glad to say that on all of these issues, there is very good cooperation between EU and NATO. In fact, it's grown over recent years. 10 years ago, the last time I was in Brussels, the two ends of town didn't always talk together. This time when I came back, the second person to say hello to me was somebody from NATO who picked up the phone. I think that's great. Over recent years, because of the threats that we've been describing, the cooperation has grown even closer. So we exercise together on cyber, for example. We have a very detailed debate about the new technologies. I have the privilege of going to the NAC regularly to talk about these things. We have to do it together.
Don't you catch my cold. I'm sipping tea here. Another question. Right here, and then behind over there. Yes.
Hi, my name is Maike Katzek. I'm with the History and Public Policy program here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank you for your talk, and I wanted to ask a question about the general legal framework of EU security policies, because I wanted to ask how does it impact the security policies that the common foreign and security politics is managed intergovernmentally and not part of the community law?
Right. So
Thank you.
there is quite a lot of the foreign policy stuff that is now part of the framework of the treaties. So there are a whole range of more traditional foreign policy issues where the discussions take place within the EU framework. There are many new issues where existing EU legislation is relevant. But we do have to strike a balance on these issues. National security, security of citizens, is and will remain a responsibility of the countries. And national authorities are going to be in the front line of keeping their citizens safe, whether that is against terrorism or cyber or some of the other challenges that we've been discussing. But there is what has changed over recent years has been the growing realization that, consistent with that, you are more effective in dealing with these matters when you work together. And so there has been a growing willingness of countries to work together, often within the framework of EU legislation and EU law, sometimes alongside that, but together as European countries to deal with these shared challenges to their shared values. It's not an area at the moment, unlike some of the economic issues like tax and taxation, it's not an area where there's a hot debate about who does what in what legal framework. Now, that might change. I could imagine there are things that could change that. But at the moment, the external threats are driving cooperation, which is sometimes on the basis of the treaties, but is driven mainly by the willingness of countries to work together.
Last question over here. I think I saw you in the middle. Yes, you. Right there. Hand is up.
Thank you very much. Mujtaba with Free Muslim Center for De-Radicalization and Extremism Prevention. The Wahhabi, Salafi, aka ISIS content is easy to eliminate or target because of the frame or shape that they have. But how about the far right extremism, which is
Good question.
which is framed as anti-ISIS, but it targets the average Joe or average Muslim or average Mary or average Muhammad, basically. How is that easy when they frame it as anti-ISIS, but they target the average Muslim? Thank you.
So I hope I didn't eliminate from my remarks a recognition that there is, as well as a challenge from violent jihadi extremism, a challenge from violent
you said
far-right extremism.
Twice. You've said it
In
twice.
certainly in Europe, and
And in the United States.
Some of that, I'm afraid, is mutually reinforcing. I mean, it feeds, both sides feed off each other, and we have got an increasing amount of radical, violent, far-right activity in Europe. In the United Kingdom, still part of the EU, the police authorities have just issued a report saying that the fastest rising threat is from the far right. So nobody underestimates the scale of the challenge, but you're right that sometimes identifying the material is complicated. We have agreed, as I said a few minutes ago, a definition in European law of what constitutes terrorist content, which allows us now to take action collectively across Europe against that, and I hope is going to allow us to have a requirement for that kind of material to be taken down very, very rapidly when it is identified. And that definition is about inciting violence. It's not a definition that says this is only, one type of extremist content. It is open and is designed to capture all of those types of extremist content. Putting it into practice, I agree with you, sometimes can be more difficult because not everyone is obliging as some ISIS, Daesh material and putting their flag on it. But that is the challenge. We have also got now all of our member states across Europe to take this challenge seriously. They're putting more resources into it. And I hope that the combination of greater awareness and targeted resources will help us to bear down on it.
So, Sir Julian, I think this audience appreciates, as I surely do, what an enormous contribution you have made to this body of work in your 4 years? Only 3 years in this exalted position. It occurs to me that every step should be taken so that you stay in this position. The EU depends on it.
Please talk to Mr.
But
Johnson.
if somebody named Mr. Johnson might either lose his job or do the wrong thing, or your country might do the wrong thing, and you don't have a job, I would like to offer you right now a position as a distinguished scholar at the Wilson Center. I think you're enormously talented.
You're on.
All
Thank
very
you very
grateful
much.
to you.
Thank you very much.